Welcome, everybody. We're going to get started in just a couple of minutes. All right, welcome, everybody. So thrilled to have you all here joining us today. My name is Daniel Aldana Cohen. I am an assistant professor of sociology here at the University of Pennsylvania here, where I direct the Socio-Spatial Climate Collaborative, or SC2. I'm one of the hosts of this event and of the event series. I will quickly say a word about this event, about the series that it's a part of. I will let you know the plan for this panel, and then I will introduce our moderator, Billy Fleming, and Billy will then in turn introduce the rest of the panel. Let me say first, we're here for a couple of very simple, straightforward reasons. First, we believe, and I'm sure if you're here in this conference with us on this panel, you also believe that there cannot be a Green New Deal in just one country. And even if you don't like the idea of a Green New Deal specifically, I think you would also agree that there cannot be climate justice in just one country. This needs to be a global discussion and a global project. At the same time, I can say with confidence, as the son of a Guatemalan immigrant to Canada, and my mother's family was badly impacted by the 1954 CIA-sponsored coup in Guatemala, that it is not always good when the United States shows leadership in the world. So we have to be very careful here in the US, progressive forces trying to take on a more global role. And so we've put together a panel series that tries to simply tackle a very basic question. How should US-based Green New Dealers and other advocates of ambitious climate justice action understand, respond to, and engage with projects for climate justice in other parts of the world? So to that end, our event today is the first in a series that is really focused, takes a kind of big, sweeping global view, thinking about how to build toward climate justice and against neo-colonialism, new concepts and priorities for just cooperation. This is the first of 3 events in a series. Each of these events is kind of co-organized by myself, Billy Fleming, today's moderator, Thea Riofrancos, and Kate Aronoff. They're all co-sponsored by SC2, the McCarg Center, Penn's Population Studies Center, and most importantly, Perry Worldhouse, which is the major funder of this event. So big thanks to all of our co-sponsors, and thanks in particular to Perry Worldhouse for making this event possible. Next week, next Tuesday, we'll take up the same basic question, but with a focus on the Americas. Is there a Pan-American Green New Deal that we can build toward? We'll talk about green investment, extraction battles, and reforestation. And then the week following, but we're still finalizing a couple details, so just save the date, on Wednesday, May 19th, we'll have an event focused on cooperation with Chinese climate politics. So let's get to the plan for today. In a second, I'll introduce Billy Fleming, our moderator. He'll introduce the rest of our speakers. Each speaker will speak for about 12 minutes, give or take. Billy will then respond and put a couple of questions to them. They will respond, and then we'll be taking questions from the audience. So as this goes, please feel free to post any comments in the chat and address those to all panelists and audience. Any questions, comments, etc. in the chat. Specific questions that you would like taken up in the Q&A, put those in the specific Q&A bubble at the bottom of your screen. You've seen these like 20,000 times now. This is obviously probably nobody's first Zoom, but so put the questions for the panelists in the Q&A bubble. Any other commentary on the side, feel free to throw it into the chat. This event will be recorded. It's live streaming right now on YouTube. Everyone who's registered for this event will get the video automatically. And later this month, we're going to have a single online dossier for this entire series. We'll, of course, have the videos from each of these events. We'll also have edited and transcribed interviews with every single panelist and every moderator, along with direct links to their work. And all those interviews are asking pretty similar questions about climate politics around the world. And that will give people a chance to, at their leisure, kind of really dig in to these questions of global climate justice from a wide range of perspectives. When you've heard a panelist speak that you're especially interested in, you'll have a chance to dive deeper into their work. And all of this stuff will be emailed to you in the weeks ahead. So extremely excited for this panel. I could not be more thrilled. Some of my favorite people in the world joining us all on Zoom, and with now well over 100 of you in the audience. Super exciting. The moderator for today will be Billy Fleming. He's the Wilkes Family Director of the Ian McHarg Center and the Weitzman School of Design here at Penn, co-director of the Climate and Community Project, along with me, former senior fellow at Data for Progress, the co-editor of the forthcoming book, An Adaptation Blueprint, co-editor and co-curator of the book and exhibit Design with Nature Now, author of the forthcoming Drowning America, The Nature and Politics of Adaptation. He is the lead author of the 2100 Project, an atlas for the Green New Deal. And Billy is also the lead author of a forthcoming Global Green New Deal Atlas project. So with that, I will turn it over to Billy.
Daniel, thanks so much. My neighbor, comrade, and work husband. So lovely to see you and to see everyone else. And I also just want to take a quick moment to say thanks to Prairie World House for sticking with us for the better part of like a year and a half as we were putting this event series together. Daniel and I and others kind of hatched this in the wake of September 2019 and the Designing a Green New Deal event he and I and Kate put together. And I think took one of the sort of central notes from that experience pretty close to heart, that we were way too focused on the US in that event and not on the rest of the world. And so with that, I'm thrilled to be able to moderate this just incredible panel of folks today. And so I'm going to do some quick introductions and then just get out of their way and let them do what they came here to do. And so I'll just go quickly through our lineup kind of in the order that everyone will speak. So we'll hear first from Dipti Bhatnagar, who coordinates the Climate Justice and Energy Program at Friends of the Earth International. Among many other things, Dipti has been an activist for 20 years with a deep-rooted sense of justice and has worked to fight destructive dams through the Save the Armada movement. And in California, worked on immigrant rights and safe drinking water for disadvantaged farm worker communities of color. And we'll hear next from Richard Quizzle Wright, the director of the Globalization and Development Strategies Division in UNCTAD. Richard holds a PhD in economics from Cambridge and has published widely on any number of economic journals. It's sort of the top of his field. And along with Kevin Gallagher as co-editor of the Oxford Handbook of Industrial Policy. And we're really excited to hear from both of them to kick us off. We'll hear next from Kian Go, former Penn faculty member who sadly, like Daniel, we've lost to the West Coast. An assistant professor, so Kian is now an assistant professor for urban planning at the UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs. She researches the relationships between urban ecological design, spatial politics, and social mobilization in the context of climate change and global urbanization. And has a fantastic new book, Form and Flow, The Spatial Politics of Urban Resilience and Climate Justice, due out later this year. And then we'll be brought home and then into the sort of Q&A or discussion section by Narasimha Rao, an associate professor in the Yale School of the Environment. His research examines the relationship between energy systems, human development, and climate change. And again, among many other things, is the recipient of the European Research Council, or ERC's, starting grant for this project, the Decent Living Energy, which is looking at energy and emission thresholds for providing decent living standards for all. And so with that, I will stop talking and turn it over to Dipti to kind of get us started. So over to you, Dipti.
Thank you, Billy. Hi, everyone. I will share my screen and share a few slides with you if you don't mind. Thanks for that lovely introduction. It's great to be a part of this really distinguished panel. I do not consider myself an activist, an academic. I consider myself very much an activist. I might do a PhD someday, but for now, this is my main work, fighting for justice all over the world. I co-coordinate the Climate Justice and Energy Program for Friends of the Earth International, and I'm based in Justice Ambiental Friends of the Earth Mozambique. So I work both at the national and the international level. So I first wanted to talk about the fact that we're not just facing a climate crisis, and that's really important to the debate, because when we think about how to confront the crisis, we really must know what the starting point is. And the fact is that we're facing multiple interrelated crises, and the poorest and the most vulnerable people in the world are really facing all of these crises, and in the worst ways possible, on their bodies, on their communities. So of course we're facing the climate crisis, but we're also facing an energy crisis. We have 800 million people across the world who do not have access to electricity. So we have an energy system which created the climate crisis and also left 800 million people out of what it was supposed to do, which is to give electricity. Of course, we're facing a biodiversity crisis. We're sitting right now in a massive health crisis. We're also facing many political crises. And you in the US, of course, know this better than anyone else, but it's also happening in India, in Brazil, in the UK, here in Mozambique. Our leaders are not representing us, the people, they're representing the polluters. And I'll talk later about what do we do about that? How do we reclaim the public sphere? We're, of course, facing an inequality crisis. And this is also very important when we think about the climate crisis, because research from Oxfam last year shows that the richest 5% of people on this planet contributed 37% of emissions from 1990 to 2015. So we know where the work needs to be done. And of course, many people are facing an unemployment crisis. They're literally struggling to survive. So equity, historical responsibility, fair shares, and climate justice, these are incredibly important concepts when we think about climate change and when we think about the global south, and when we really look at it as a planetary crisis where the entire globe is involved. And the climate crisis is so inherently unjust because it already affects, and it's going to affect the most, people and countries who contributed to it the least. That's what makes it just so unjust. And that's why when we talk about climate justice, we're talking about correcting that injustice. We're talking about those who created the crisis need to take the responsibility first and fastest to address the crisis and not leave the southern countries with the bill. So Friends of the Earth International, along with many, many other groups, this work is all done in alliance with many movements, many organizations. We've done work on the fair share. So what do the numbers actually look like in terms of who has created the crisis, who produced the emissions, and hence who needs to do the most to address the crisis? And looking specifically at the US, many US groups, including Friends of the Earth US, ActionAid US, Corporate Accountability, Oil Change International, WIDO, Center for Biological Diversity, you can see the names up there, many, many more, released what should be the US fair shares framework, right? So if the US were really to do its fair share, was to step up and do its fair share, what would that look like? And they released that on the 8th of April. And what it says, I can put the link into the chat for all of you later so that you can read the entire document yourself. The US must reduce 195% of its emissions based on 2005 levels by 2030. And of course, you're looking at me and saying 195% is more than 100%. How is that even possible? So there's a very deliberate framework in the document, which you will see in the fair shares framework actually explains that really well, that the US and Europe and some of the other northern countries have actually emitted so much more than their fair share that they actually cannot do their fair share just in domestic emissions reductions. What it means is they need to bring a sense of solidarity and actually support the transition in southern countries. That's how they'll meet their fair share. That's not doing anything extra. That has nothing to do with climate finance. That's just meeting their basic fair share. Of course, there's a climate finance component to all of this because there is a climate debt owed from the global north to the global south. And what the US must provide is $800 billion between 2021 and 2030. And that's not the entire figure. That is what's called a good faith down payment, and there's more to come. And just to put that in a tiny bit of context, our friend Brandon Wu at ActionAid US talked about the fact that the Pentagon's military budget for 2022 is $800 billion. So we can put that number into context. And of course, the Fair Shares document of civil society also demands regulatory measures to stop fossil fuel expansion. So this was the 8th of April. And then the 22nd of April, as you all know, the day of the Climate Leaders Summit, so-called, the US released its NDC, its Nationally Determined Contribution. Sorry, I should have put the full form into the document. It's not nice to use abbreviations. But the US Nationally Determined Contribution says that they will reduce 50 to 52% of their emissions based on 2005 levels by 2030. You can do the maths. The Fair Share says they need to reduce 195%. What the US has committed to, not done anything yet, what it has committed to is to say we'll reduce 1/4 of that. So this is where US groups come in to hold the government accountable, to say this is not enough. This is 1/4 of what our commitment, what our fair share really should be. The numbers on climate finance are completely vague, and we talked about earlier how it compares to the military budget. So the money exists, the political will is what we really need to fight for and generate. And then there's a US lending arm, which is called the US Exim Bank, the Export-Import Bank, which has provided $4 billion for overseas fossil fuel finance in the last 5 years. They're funding the Mozambique gas disaster. The photo that you see there on the top is from Cabo Delgado province in northern Mozambique. I don't know if you've heard what's going on. I can put some links in the chat. It's really horrific. This is the story of resource curse. Like what we're seeing unfolding in Mozambique before our eyes is what happens when a fossil fuel is discovered in a place with extreme poverty, with a huge amount of corruption, with all the impunity of transnational corporations, and the tragedy that plays out is what we're seeing happening before our eyes. So this needs to be stopped. And Exim Bank has made absolutely no statements about what they're going to do about reducing their fossil fuel finance. And then there's another lending arm of the US government called the US Development Finance Corporations. And their claim is really interesting. So they said, and I'm sure you've heard this term before, they said we're going to go net zero by 2040. And I wanted to talk to you just a couple of minutes about net zero and just how big of a smokescreen and how problematic and what a corporate strategy it is. And you see on the screen there, this is a report called Not Zero that Friends of the Earth International and some allies produced at the end of last year. And there's Friends of the Earth International and many more allies also produced a document called the Chasing Carbon Unicorns, the Deception of Carbon Markets and Net Zero. So just to tell you in a couple of lines, net zero is really about the net. It's not zero, it's net zero, meaning we can put some emissions into the air and then we can suck them out later, and the net should be zero. Now, the fossil cycle and the natural carbon cycle, as you can see in that bathtub analogy, which comes from the IPCC, from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, are totally different. The fossil cycle is producing so much emissions, it's not possible to sequester them or to suck them out of the air. But let's think for a minute, what is the plan to actually so-called suck these emissions out of the air and to sequester them? The idea is to go to the lands, to the forests of people in the global south, in Mozambique, all across Africa, in Latin America, in Southeast Asia, where the ecosystems still survive because indigenous peoples and local communities have made them survive and kept them alive. So the plan for Shell and Bank of America and Citigroup and all these corporations that have put out net zero targets, including the University of Pennsylvania, which has a net zero target. We can talk about that later. The idea really is we're going to keep emitting, we're going to keep polluting, and we'll find someone else's land to be able to sequester that carbon. So this is a really big problem. That's why we call it a smokescreen. That's why we call it a corporate strategy. And this is not going to work. And we're absolutely here to say no to that, because it's going to be extremely damaging and it's going to provoke more land grabs than are already happening. So this is a concept of net zero and the problem with it that I definitely want to leave folks with. This is just a cartoon about what does that actually look like when a forest that local communities and indigenous peoples use, and suddenly it becomes barricaded. So what is it that we're really calling for? When we talk about a Green New Deal should be decolonial, Friends of the Earth International is not fully comfortable with the term Green New Deal, but that's okay. It's the conversation is important. What is it that we want to demand for? What is it that we want to see? As Daniel said in the very beginning, a global Green New Deal cannot be in a certain country. It really needs to be global. So in Friends of the Earth, we call it system change. We need to push for system change. And what that means, for one, is an urgent coordinated phase out of fossil fuel production and consumption. And that also needs to come with equity. So that's the number one issue that we need to deal with. We need to stop the emissions tap and not plan to suck it out later. The second issue is, what are the principles that actually underpin the transformation of the energy system that we want to see? So this isn't just, turn off coal and put renewables and then we'll see what happens. It has to be accompanied by certain principles. Our energy transformation needs to be about energy sufficiency. Remember the 800 million people across this planet who do not have access to electricity. It needs to be about energy sovereignty. It needs to be about energy as a common good and not as a commodity. It needs to be about community-owned, low-impact renewable energy, not provoking green extractivism for raw earth minerals in the global south to be able to feed the solar energy demands of consumers in the north. So these are the principles that need to be a part of the energy transformation. We produced this document a couple of years ago. It's called People Power Now Energy Manifesto, and it's demands for the energy system for people and the planet, what I was talking about. But that's not all. This transformation isn't just going to be about energy. When we talk about what does a decolonial system change scenario look like, we need to think about food and land. Those communities that have taken care of their forests, their lands that are now under attack because of net zero, we actually need to go further than not just grabbing their lands. We actually need to make sure that they actually have the rights to be able to continue to live on that land, because they're actually using that land and those forests to stay alive. It's not just about land as a strategy, let's gather some land. They're actually using those to keep their communities alive. So we need to talk about rights for those communities. We need to support practices like community forest management and peasant agroecology, because again, these are the people who are really taking care of the earth. And also peasant agroecology right now is what is feeding 70% of the people on the planet. Don't let anybody tell you that it's big ag that's feeding the planet. There's another dimension of our demands for real zero or for system change, a decolonial system change, which is a new economics. Let's not forget the care work, and we've seen this during the pandemic, especially who takes care of our kids, who takes care of our elders, who actually takes care of us being able to feed ourselves and clothe ourselves, and the reproduction of life from day to day. Well, what's really important to keep ourselves alive. And that care work, and of course, the healthcare workers very much play a role in that. Garbage collectors really play a role in that. So who is doing that care work? Who is doing that domestic work? And is that recognized? And we need to be able to share that responsibility between men, women, and the state. Most importantly, this isn't an individual act. This really needs to be supported by the state. We need to reclaim the public sphere. We need to support public services. Health, that's one of the things that we're seeing during the pandemic, but also water, energy, education, etc. And how do we pay for those? We need fair, transparent, and redistributive tax systems. And you in the US know better than anyone else, you're trying to raise the corporate tax a little bit, and the hoo-ha that's happening is really horrific. So, but that's where the money needs to come from the elites. And of course, we demand binding rules on transnational corporations. This work is going on for many, many years in Geneva. Maybe Richard will talk about that later. That work needs to be done. And we do not allow transnational corporations to use the investor-state dispute settlement to sue states because they have good climate policies, because this is happening. So we need to really be able to fight against that. We need to demand a world that's free from patriarchy and all systems of oppression, domination, and inequality. We need to demand an end to the logic of capital accumulation. So when I'm talking about system change, I'm really talking about a fundamental shift in our thinking, not, okay, we had extractivism earlier, now we need to have a green extractivism. We had a New Deal, now it's a Green New Deal. It's not going to work for people or the planet. We really need to think about an end to this logic. And what is the logic that should replace it? The centrality of life, the centrality of the sustainability of life, and at the same time, our interconnectedness. Okay, I'm ending now. Since the Green New Deal was launched in 2019, there have been some really, really interesting critiques from mostly brown and black people in the US and the UK, which is also really interesting when we think about domestic racial dynamics. And I think those are voices that we need to be able to hear. And when we think about how to really make the Green New Deal decolonial, these are the voices within these countries. And of course, from the global South that we need to be listening to, and that we need to move forward to be able to strengthen whatever policies are happening at the US, because as Daniel said in the beginning, this really needs to be truly, truly global if it's going to work for people and the planet. So we really need to be able to take these critiques and make things better. Thank you very much. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Dippy. That was amazing. So we're going to come to Richard next, and then to Kian.
Billy, thanks a lot. Thanks to Danielle and the organizers for the invitation. I just want to try and give you a flavor of how we in my world got to the idea of a global Green New Deal as a way of thinking about the combined development and environmental challenges that we are all facing in one way or another. Internationalism is hardwired into what we do at UNCTAD. Developing countries have always understood that their problems require international cooperation and coordination if they're going to meet the needs of their population. And I mean, in the 50s into the 60s, with political independence, they quickly realized that they were facing a set of economic rules of the game that didn't really accommodate their needs and often worked against them. And UNCTAD, the organization I work for, was created in a sense to give voice to those frustrations and to propose changes to the then existing multilateral system in a way that would better address the problems of developing countries. And we quickly found out that in a way, we were not looking to fundamentally overturn that system. We were kind of reformist in nature. We were trying to get the multilateral and the international community to live up to its rhetoric. So, you know, they promised help on balance of payments as developing countries put the gas on the pedal. They didn't get it. They were promised help on more predictable forms of long-term financing in the form of ODA. They didn't get it. They were promised help in dealing with the abusive practices of large multinational corporations in their markets, particularly commodities. They didn't get it. And our job was to try and push the system in a way that would address these kinds of issues, culminated in the idea of a new international economic order that was the big kind of narrative that dominated international economic discussions in the 1970s. UNCTAD was backstopping that kind of initiative. And it made progress, but it ultimately failed and was replaced by a very different kind of system that I guess you're all familiar with. We can call it hyperglobalization, we can call it neoliberalism, we can call it the Washington Consensus. In a way, it was a system in which the traditional kind of goals of the old system, full employment, workers' rights, welfare state, were replaced by footloose capital, intellectual property rights, free markets as the way in which not only the domestic economies were organized, but also the way in which those economies were meant to integrate into the global economy. And I guess I don't need to tell this audience, but we've done a lot of work on it. This is a system that has been highly unequal. Inequality is hardwired into the rules of the game of this hyperglobalized world. It's deeply insecure. It's highly indebted. Indebtedness is a way in which the system hangs itself together. And ironically, because it sells itself as a system that's good for business, it's a system that actually generates an insufficient amount of investment, at least in the kind of stuff that matters to people's lives. It's very good for financial investors, but it's not good in terms of capital formation and investment in capacity and in skills. And it's a highly predatory model. Rent-seeking is hardwired into the rules of the game. It benefits large corporations over smaller businesses and workers. And it's kind of sold, it's been sold for 30 years as a system to which there is no alternative. Although TINA, there is no alternative, is often associated with the language of Thatcher and Reagan. It was the kind of liberal centrists, the Blairs and the Clintons of this world, who actually mastered and finessed this system in the 1990s and into the 2000s, and we were endlessly told that there was no alternative to this system at the national or indeed at the international level. And that kind of argument, I guess, began to fall apart in the 2000s. Crises were actually always inherent in the system. Developing countries were endlessly subject to all kinds of financial shocks and economic crises of one kind or another. So were advanced economies. You know, in the United States, you had the savings and loan crisis, you had long-term capital management, you had the Enron scandals, etc. Even as Ben Bernanke was selling this as a great moderation, these kind of crises persisted, but somehow the system was able to gloss over those until, of course, the 2008-2009 financial crisis, when the system really skidded off the rails in a very significant and profound way. And a lot of talk about change was expected, hasn't happened. I'll come back to that in a second. But economic crises were not the only issue that came to the fore as this hyperglobalized system evolved. China emerged unexpectedly as a challenge to Western powers, managed to maneuver this system in a way that most other developing countries were not able to maneuver it. And that's an important question that we might want to talk about, because it does have significant ramifications for talking about the climate challenge. And of course, there was growing evidence that this highly predatory system, as Dipta just talked about, was increasingly bad for environmental stability and the health of the planet. And I guess after the 2008-2009 crisis and the kind of convergence of crises and climate breakdown gave you the first blush of the talk of a Green New Deal, which I think was largely in the United Kingdom. It was a kind of highly statist response to the problem, the kind of Keynesian response in which we could spend our way out of the economic crisis, and as long as we spent on stuff that was environmentally friendly, we could combine the climate challenge with the economic challenge. That idea crashed as neoliberal ideology came roaring back in the form of austerity, and all hope of that kind of agenda was very quickly put to one side. But it's come back now, importantly, by adding that kind of original idea, that kind of Keynesian idea of a state-led response to crises, with the notion of a just transition and a much broader concept of the alliances that are required to push for a global Green New Deal. Although many of the policies, I think, that come out of that are familiar, and certainly the policies that we've supported in our work in UNCTAD. It's anti-austerity. It insists on a very large role for public investment and public services as a key to a more sustainable and inclusive future. It's all about progressive taxation, the centrality of regulating footloose finance and highly speculative forms of financial capital. Big role for development banks usually figures in any Green New Deal wherever it's talked about. Industrial policy, strategic planning are critical to the kind of policy agenda that is involved in Green New Deals, whether that's discussed in the United States or Western Europe or South Africa or Latin America. All these ingredients, there's a set of familiar ingredients, I think, to a Green New Deals that certainly we have been advocating in UNCTAD for some time. But as I guess the theme of this of today's discussion and this series is about, this cannot be an agenda that is dominated by and for advanced economies for all kinds of reasons, not least of which is that some of the reasons that Dipti talk about responsibility, but also because growth in the next 20 or 30 years is going to take place in the South. But output growth and population growth is going to take place in the South. And if they replicate the carbon-heavy growth path that advanced economies have followed, then whatever advanced economies do will not solve the climate problem. So I think we know that. But the question remains: what's in the Green New Deal for developing countries? And I guess there's one set of countries that already has a big stake in this, and those are the countries that are already suffering from climate shocks of one kind or another. There are many developing countries that are suffering serious adaptation crises, small island economies, low-lying countries, countries in the tropics that are suffering from all kinds of soil degradation. You know the kind of problems, and obviously those countries are already suffering from the changes to the climate and the need for global growth models to change. And that's incredibly important, but it's not enough, because developing countries continue to suffer their long-standing development crises. They suffer from massive burdens of debt. They are, and this is a tricky one for the climate community, they are deindustrializing prematurely at a time that they need to diversify their economies if they are going to see rising living standards and improving employment prospects for their population. They're clearly losing out in the digital divide, a long-standing problem that developing countries have faced when it comes to technology and the need for technological catch-up. And they're not catching up. So they're already facing climate problems, but they're not doing what, at least from our point of view in the UN, they need to be doing, which is closing the gaps with the advanced economies in terms of economic and social opportunities and prospects. And to do that, developing countries, as Dipti said, need a lot of energy to be able to drive that kind of catch-up story. They need access to technology, the cutting-edge technologies that will not destroy the planet, and they need access to a lot of finance, because they have major constraints still when it comes to mobilizing resources at the domestic level. And for us, that's where the Global Green New Deal comes in, because it requires a lot of international cooperation and support to be able to provide those elements of a supportive international environment that can deliver on both the environment and the development fronts. And the big problem that we face, of course, is that we don't think the contemporary multilateral system is fit for purpose. We thought we've complained endlessly in the work that we do about the lack of finance that is available to developing countries, the problems with intellectual property rights, access to technology, etc. So we, our beef now is to try and advocate reforms at the multilateral level that will kind of deliver the kind of environment that combines issues around traditional economics around economic justice in the South with the climate justice problems that are looming. And we've advocated for a set of principles, that work we've done with Boston University, Kevin Gallagher, a set of new principles for a different kind of multilateralism that can, we hope, deliver on both the development front as well as meeting the very dangerous threat of a climate breakdown. So that's essentially how we've got from where we began 60 years ago to advocating a global Green New Deal today. So thanks, Billy.
Thank you so much, Richard. And so with that really fabulous talk, we will now turn to Kian. So I'll throw it back to you.
Thank you. So I want to thank the organizers. Thanks, Billy. Thanks, Daniel, and to Thea and Kate as well. And my co-panelists. It's a really wonderful opportunity to talk about these critical issues. So my name is Kian Go, and I am an assistant professor of urban planning at UCLA. And my main research is on the spatial politics of urban climate change responses. So the remarks I'll make today focus on my work, primarily on the urban, and then ending with a couple of points that tie into some of the discussions from today. So my book titled Form and Flow, The Spatial Politics of Urban Resilience and Climate Justice, forthcoming, I'm excited to say, in August this year from the MIT Press. So the book examines the contestations around urban climate change responses. It traces flows of ideas and influence in and between New York City, Jakarta, Indonesia, and Rotterdam in the Netherlands. And it looks at major plans as well as efforts among community organizations and informal settlement activists. So the book finds broadly that one, there's a new wave of urban climate change interventions driven by environmental urgency, development pressures, and global networks of expertise. And these are mobilized often towards new modes of capital accumulation in the face of environmental catastrophe. And it finds too, the rise of social movements organized in response to historical injustices and present-day challenges. So I'll take one view through this work right now. So Jakarta, Indonesia confronts frequent and severe floods with a massive inundation affecting about a third of the city or more about every 6 to 7 years. And this is not so surprising. The urban region is low-lying, threaded by 13 rivers, crisscrossed by canals, floodgates, and catchment ponds. So it is poised to flood, really. And this is made worse now by rapid land subsidence caused by groundwater pumping and rampant urban development, rising seas, and increasingly uncertain precipitation. And in Jakarta, we've seen long seen these efforts by political and economic elites to evict and demolish the informal kampong settlements that are home to the poorest urban residents in the city. And so these kampong settlements have historically been pushed and cordoned off in low-lying, risky coastal and riverbank areas through both the colonial years and post-colonial years. And these are areas that are now prized for waterfront development. In Jakarta, the pressures against these informal settlements are heightened by the planning of large-scale urban infrastructural projects that are ostensibly geared towards flood protection, so addressing the chronic flood issues. For example, a few years ago, we had the announcement for a prominent project called the Giant Seawall Master Plan, a mega project that in its initial form was for a new city for 1.5 million people built on landfill in the Jakarta Bay. This plan for the giant seawall is like, in some ways, true to the history of development plans, large-scale, top-down, technocratic, and tuned towards a modern urban future. So these large-scale planning efforts are supported not only by the political and economic elites in these cities, but by an emerging network of global environmental governance and an international cohort of professionals. In Jakarta, these are often of Dutch origin, reflecting the 300 years or so of Dutch colonial presence in Indonesia. And their work, this cohort of professionals and experts, they build on historical familiarity, actually noting the colonial years, born of, so 300 years of colonialism and now 70 years or so of post-colonial development aid, claims to expertise and appeals to this kind of environmental catastrophe. And when you talk to Jakarta city officials, you'll hear things like, quote, "There's no other way. If not, we will be increasingly flooded." So in my research in the book, I show how we cannot understand the motivations of the Dutch engineers, hydrologists, and urban designers, and economic development consultants in places like Jakarta and in other places, without looking at what's going on back in the Netherlands. And there, economic liberalization and global environmental change, so climate change, have reconfigured Dutch spatial planning and water management. And it has reconfigured really what is often considered to be a national project, so Dutch spatial planning and water management, both inwards towards the cities, so centering urban economic development as an environmental project, and outwards towards the globe, so the whole planet, expanding the presence and the influence of Dutch global consultants around economic development efforts focused on climate change and environmental management. So in differing places around the world, these kinds of globalizing urban environmental projects land with various levels of ease. So in Jakarta, the case that I'm talking to you about right now, the disparate power relationships that are born of colonial and post-colonial Dutch ties are also coupled with Indonesian nation building and state making, and made urgent by both the appeals to and the reality of environmental catastrophe. Colonial power manifests still in the post-colonial years, what Anne Stoler, the anthropologist, has called imperial formations, now threaten to be reconfigured into more market-friendly, development-ready solutions appropriate for 21st century environmental problems and global economic conditions. So from this research and from some parallel work on the Green New Deal, looking at the possibility of changing society and state relationships and their implications for urban spatial planning, I can make two primary observations that are relevant for our conversation today. And, honestly, these are incomplete and still forming thoughts for me, and I bring them up really in the spirit of sharing and in the co-production of knowledge. So first, around state and big public actions. So this panel and its organizers, many of us really, are interested in the potential of a global Green New Deal. Here in the US, the Green New Deal has been propelled by ideas about public investments, state oversight and coordination, and along with that, ground-up community organizing and community-based political framing. And we've seen a manner of this kind of society-state relationship change before during the original New Deal. And in some ways, we would like to see it again with better politics, with more accountability, with more community and grassroots agency. So I would say that society-state relationships in many places in the global South are different. They have different and distinct dynamics, historically constituted across decades and centuries of colonial and post-colonial social and spatial marginalization. And so in Jakarta, for instance, poor urban residents in these informal kampung settlements are often just outright called illegal and plainly seen as outside the vision of the modern city. This constantly perpetuated image of the urban poor exacerbates their situation when confronted by the urban and the proposition of these climate and environmental projects. They're just more easily blamed and disregarded as a consequence almost of these projects. And alongside, I think another key point is many nation states around the world, certainly including Indonesia, have been driven by post-colonial developmentalism. So state building, nation building, and city building often rot together, which casts a different light, I think, on what it means to have a big public plan. So for me, some kind of Green New Deal in these different urban conditions around the world would involve a parallel set of transformed society and state relationships that may not be quite the same as we envision in the US. So we've seen in Jakarta, informal settlement activists and pro-poor community organizers fight for such transformed relationships, posing ground-up visions of the future in response to the environmental and development threats and pushing back on state actions. And then second, I'm timing this, but my timer has stopped. So I'm going to finish quickly because I probably have gone on too long. Second point on transnational solidarities. So as scholars like Malini Ranganathan have said, we see emerging solidarities around the world. So decolonial connections, linking, for example, Black Lives Matter protests in the US with racial justice and Black Lives Matter protests all around the world, as well as solidarities among working peoples and among indigenous rights groups. These solidarities are cross-site, multi-scalar, and multi-level, and really these are exciting movements for me. And of course, we have to note that the stakes are not the same between oppressed communities here in the US and those in so many places around the world, even with these solidarities, especially when speaking in terms of climate and carbon, as Dipti pointed out so well earlier. But I think these emerging solidarities are important. So across these different sites in Global South and North, I see a pattern in many cases, a kind of top-down climate plan, often tuned towards the protection and maintenance of business as usual political economic systems, and ground-up counter movements posing alternative ideas of climate futures. And there's an insistence among these ground-up counter movements on ideas about difference, of particular grounded shared struggles. And they look towards making connections across place. And in some ways, I see that we might be building a new grand narrative of sorts of these solidarities of difference. So these counter movements are often by nature not big enough. They're localized. They often they offer alternatives, but have not yet offered or resulted in transformative urban governance, for instance. But I think they offer together visions of different ways to move forwards for us. They model different society-state relationships and offer different social and spatial ways of life. They build a catalog of struggles, a catalog of possibilities that I think we can start to build on, to research and to organize on. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you, Kian. And so we'll come next to Narasimha to take us through our last presentation, and then we'll turn to some of the excellent questions coming through in the Q&A. So over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I'm really glad that you have organized this conference in the first place, and it's really nice to hear all these wonderful comments from my fellow panelists. You'll see some of the ideas you've heard before echo in my presentation as well. What I wanted to do was to dig into this idea of common but differentiated responsibilities, which has pretty much fallen by the wayside in international negotiations so far. And much like Kian, I'd like to present some ideas from my research, where I've been trying to think, how can we, based on principles of justice, come up with some reasonably practical recommendations for how to differentiate responsibilities. And I think we really have to act now in the lead up to the next climate negotiations in order to find something that's actually practicable. The Paris Agreement enshrines in it this principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and differentiating countries' responsibilities based on their different circumstances. And this phrase has found its way right from the initial climate accord, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, accord after accord, all the way until the Paris Agreement, in verbiage, in words, but in practice, not at all. The pledges to the Paris Agreement are voluntary, aspirational, and completely non-binding, and they pretty much treat all countries alike. And there's a risk that now the US and other industrialized countries will put pressure on other countries to take on zero emissions targets, because the default view is we have to all bring our emissions down to zero or net zero, but that does not take into account different national circumstances. So how do we do that? Well, one of the principles that also has been enshrined for decades is that dealing with climate change is inextricably linked to poverty eradication. And so we want countries to be able to protect the interests of bringing people out of poverty and achieving a certain basic living standard. But what does that mean? We put a little bit more content to that. I find a picture can tell 1,000 words. Here is the emissions trajectory of countries only in the recent past. And you're seeing over here at the bottom, the 3.5 billion people in this world that have a fairly high living standard, from $10,000 per capita to $100,000 per capita. And this includes China, the US in pink, and all the other OECD countries that have benefited from cheap fossil fuels, achieved high levels of growth, and now are beginning to flatten out their level of emissions. But on the other hand, we have another 3.5 billion people, mostly in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, with very low living standards, who have per capita incomes that are order of magnitude lower than the other 3.5 billion. Their economies are growing fast. They need energy in order to bring up living standards. And in the face of that, those development challenges, we now have this enormous challenge thrust upon us to try and turn around emissions and bring them to zero as soon as possible. And so as you can see, in this white space is the remaining carbon budget that is available. How is it that developing countries are going to be able to meet their development needs without having the opportunity to grow based on cheap energy? And so that is really the dilemma we face. And if we try and understand at least this one challenge of eradicating poverty, we see it's a massive deprivation of human rights in a way. We have billions of people who persistently have been cooking with solid fuels that kill women and children. We have billions of people who suffer a lack of adequate nutrition that causes all sorts of health effects, people living in conditions that are inhuman, as well as having unsafe sanitation. And the question is, if one of our principles of justice is that we want to at least exempt these people or their development needs from the costs of dealing with climate change, well, what does that really imply? If energy is fundamentally what they need, we don't need emissions, we need energy. Well, what is the amount of energy that needs to be protected globally in order to make sure people can climb out of poverty? And so that's what I spent a lot of time trying to address. One of the things that we want to do is safeguard poverty eradication efforts in the world. And so I've spent a number of years trying to answer this question and essentially trying to calculate what the energy needs would be in different parts of the world to provide everyone with a basic living standard, one that is not just acute poverty, but provides people with adequate space, comfort, and the amenities in a basic society to seek social affiliation, as well as to enjoy comforts of a decent home. And after many years of research, we came up with some what I think are interesting findings. Here I'm showing you globally, this is the amount of energy that countries on average use in relation to their income per capita. And you see this green line is what we estimate to be the amount of energy that you need to provide people with this basic living standard, which includes a modest amount of physical space, but durable materials, as well as access to infrastructure to travel using motorized transport, including public transport, to be able to have internet, to be able to have basic cold storage and nutritious food at home. And that's really just a small fraction of the amount of energy we see being used across the world with growing affluence. And so the finding is that most of the energy today is not serving people's basic well-being, it's serving affluence. And what's also interesting is that a lot of that energy is even in developing countries, namely that in developing countries also, or emerging economies, a lot of the energy demand growth today is to serve the affluence of a few people in those societies. And that the amount of energy, even in emerging economies, that will be required to provide basic living standards is well within a lot of countries' overall energy use. Of course, this doesn't apply to a lot of sub-Saharan African countries that are extremely poor, whose energy growth would have to be significant, significantly more than what it currently is. But nevertheless, the lesson here is that we need equitable development and policies even within developing countries to make sure that we are maximizing the energy we have to be able to direct it to human development. And so we found overall that meeting basic living standards require about a quarter of global energy use on average from now to 2040. So in some ways, one can think that this is the level of energy that needs to be protected from the high costs of mitigation to the extent that they are high. So one of the principles then that I think echoes what we heard earlier from Dipti, although I haven't actually quantified it, is that the United States and other OECD countries need to aim not for net zero, but for net negative by 2050, at least in order to provide this exemption for countries to eradicate poverty. And now what we have is some sense for what that really entails in terms of energy needs. And we need to translate that reasonably into emissions based on all countries pursuing reasonable efforts to reduce emissions and provide energy that is clean to its citizens. So that's only one part of the puzzle, because we still need to understand that all countries have people who want to aspire to qualities of life beyond just meeting their basic living standards. And so this is not the only principle that needs to govern the allocation of differentiated responsibilities. So one other thought is to think about this as a technology problem. So it is not entirely a technology problem, but we do have to deal with decarbonizing the entire energy sector across the world. And people have spent time trying to understand what those investments requirements are. And so some studies have found that looking across a range of different models that conduct this kind of analyses, that the green investments that would be required in renewable energy technologies, and sequestering carbon or nuclear, and upgrading electricity grids and upgrading buildings would be on the order of $1 to $1.5 trillion a year globally. The higher number is if we're aiming for 1.5 degrees, and the lower number, closer to 1.1 or 2 trillion, would be if we're aiming for just 2 degrees. But what's important about that too is that if we were to redirect the existing investments in fossil energy, which, as you heard, are significant, up to $800 billion a year, then the additional requirements of green investments actually are on the order of $800 billion. So it's really important that we redirect existing investments. And so the question is, here is an actual tangible cost that we need to be invested in from the industrialized countries. We need them to take the lead. We need for industrialized countries to invest in these markets to bring down their costs so that they become affordable to developing countries. So that's a clear role, I think, of leadership that we need in industrialized countries, which is market creation for these advanced technologies. So another principle we may think about is how to allocate that cost across countries. And if we were to think about allocating it in proportion to countries' GDP share today, or if we were to think about it in terms of cumulative contribution of emissions, these are sort of capacity and responsibility-based views that have been around for decades right now and thinking about responsibility to mitigate. The US's share of these green investments would be a quarter of what I mentioned. So in the order of $250 to $400 billion a year in order to meet what would be potentially a fair share. So those are two elements I wanted to put forth. Now, having said all that about technology leadership, I do think that technology is not enough. It's only part of the problem. We have a global economy that's based on principles of unbridled growth. And we need some serious structural changes to rein in consumption. Otherwise, we're chasing a moving target. And in order to do that, we also need industrialized countries to take the lead. Because I would argue that most of the efforts within these countries has been focused on energy supply and relying on technology to bail us out, when we really have to think about consumption. Thinking about, for example, the size of homes. The new American homes today, on average, are double the size of homes in Northern Europe that have a very high standard of living. And this is contributed to, of course, by the McMansions, but the average size of homes are increasing. We throw away a quarter of our food production in the world. And so there's a tremendous amount of waste and consumption that does not really improve our well-being that we also need to rein in. And so that's another important pillar. And the last thing I want to say is that we really need to focus on equitable development. As I mentioned, there's many opportunities in developing countries where if you redirect energy use and development policy towards the needs of people, things like healthcare, basic education, basic amenities in the home, such as water and sanitation, those are a lot less energy intensive than investing in everyone having an SUV and everyone having a giant home. And so equitable development across the world, I think, means lower greenhouse gas emissions. And needless to say, the same thing goes in industrialized countries, where if we focus on really thinking about our most basic well-being, I think we'll be moving towards a planet that will require less energy, which means less emissions overall. So I'd stop with that, and I look forward to your questions and conversation. Thanks.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And actually, perfect timing. You probably heard my timer was going off as I was turning my screen back on. So I'll ask all of our panelists to sort of come back up. And I'll just say sort of a few words here, because there's just these were such, I think, enriching presentations from each of you. And I'll just say a word or two about each of them, and then bring us into our first question or two. And then we have 18 in our Q&A, so we obviously won't get to all of them, but I'll try and suss some themes out and get to a few of the sort of meta questions there. And I'll just start I'll go in the kind of order of presentation. And I just found my dog is sitting in my lap. You'll see her poking her head up and down kind of as we go here. And, I felt like I was scaring her quite a bit throughout this presentation, because I just kept like yelling yes and like snapping my fingers during all of these presentations. I think beginning especially with Dipti, who I think just did an incredible job of reminding us of the sort of differentiated responsibilities both between and within the global North and South, and really putting a set of, I think, just incredibly concrete and necessary demands on the table for what it might mean to both ask for and enact global climate justice, through the framework that was presented here. And I think really helping me think, or reminding me to think more about how the Divest Invest framework sort of operates at a global scale. And I think, in particular here at Penn, knowing just a couple of weeks ago, and you sort of alluded to this in your presentation, that we've adopted this sort of net zero standard for divestment in our endowment, what that actually means, right? So ways to, again, like bring that sort of a framework from a submerged to a foregrounded position for all of us. And then I think, for Richard, I think really reminded me, it feels like a long time ago, and it was in some ways a long time ago, just how much has changed since the Great Recession from 2007 to 2009. And thinking about what crisis-driven politics looks like back then versus now, knowing they're wildly insufficient now, but just thinking about the sort of dominance of austerity politics, particularly in the West, that characterized so much of 2007, 2008, 2009, and what became kind of colloquially known here as the Obama stimulus, but obviously extended well beyond that. And I think for Kian, knowing your work like especially well, I think amongst this panel was just like, I think so excited to see sort of where you've landed with the book, and thinking about what international solidarity might look like for the climate justice movement, given how much international solidarity is already enjoyed by the sort of water engineering technocracy and the other global elites who've made this diffusion of resilience thinking around the world possible. And then for Narasimha, I think, again, like really helping me think really concretely about what a global Green New Deal might actually look like in concrete terms, beyond the kind of abstract slogans and into actual sort of instruments of sort of redistribution and reparations. And I think for all of these was just reminded in some ways of the sort of joint session address from President Biden a week ago that was, I think, really disappointingly framed around sort of inflaming this growing Cold War between the US and China, and this idea of sort of domestic climate justice for us and global climate justice for the rest of us, for the rest of the world. And so, I think with that, there are a bunch of questions that are obviously like kicking around in my head here that I could ask about, but I wonder if you might all just like say a word or two about like the frontiers of possibility here. So thinking about what this like focus on climate justice at home only, so within nations, might look like, and what the possibilities of a more internationalist, cooperative, actually global Green New Deal, so a Green New Deal that's global in cooperation, not in consequences, might or should look like. And so that's I'm going to give you the easy question first, obviously. So I'll let you think about it for just a second, but whoever wants to jump in first, we don't need to keep stack. You can just kind of unmute yourself and get in there.
I can say something to that, Billy. It's really interesting because it goes to the question of scale. At what scale do we operate? And there's a very interesting question. I've been reading all of the questions. And one of the questions is about how do we really bring in equity in local organizing? And it was such a fantastic question. It really got me thinking, well, how do you do that? And it got me thinking about the scale at which we need to operate. And really, the solidarity needs to be built up from the ground up. But we really need to be talking about some things at the global scale. And that's just absolutely critical. Just as when we have our private car, the state has already built the roads and the highways, in the case of US, for those cars to operate. Each private person doesn't need to take their road with them. So there are certain services. That's why the public services idea is so important, because there are some services which it really doesn't make sense to individualize to a community level or to a lower scale. We really need to be thinking about a big scale. So the question is really pertinent because it goes to how do you build from the grassroots up, and what Kian was talking about as well, really beautiful about this work has to be done. The global Green New Deal has to start locally, and that understanding of equity and justice has to come in from the lowest levels and build up. But we actually do need to do that building up, because we need to be able to operate at these national and global scales. And that comes from solidarity, having conversations like this, where we've got Northern and Southern activists and academics coming together to talk about these issues. I feel like when we think about scale, we need to really look at the entire chain and make sure that solidarity and justice is at the root of it at every level.
Yeah, I can say something. Neoliberalism has done a very good job at undermining state capacity and allowing the private sector to capture the public agenda. It's been remarkably successful at doing that, and I think that can only effectively be challenged at the local or the national level. I think that idea of embedding countervailing narratives and power has to be done first and foremost at the national level. And in our world, that the missing ingredient, what distinguishes success stories from non-success stories over the last 70 years, at least 60 years at least, is this idea of developmental states that have this ability essentially to discipline local capital. That's, there's lots of discussions about that, but when you look at these success stories, they've been very effective at disciplining local capital. They've encouraged it at the same time, but they've found that combination of discipline and incentive that has kind of worked for them. Our challenge, when we look at the world of the IMF and the World Bank and the WTO and the institutions that we interact with, they have been part and parcel of these efforts to kind of limit the ability of developing countries to forge those national public institutions in a whole set of dimensions. And, you know, our gripe with the IMF and the World Bank and the WTO is not that we don't need these institutions. We need these kinds of institutions. It's the way in which they have evolved, particularly over the last 30 years, and the gaps that they have left that I think need to be addressed very urgently if the narrative of a global Green New Deal is to be credible with developing country policymakers, and that they have the confidence that any efforts that they undertake at the national level will be supported and amplified by these kinds of multilateral institutions that are not going away anytime soon. I think it's the need to recapture those institutions is going to be a very important component of successfully disseminating the kind of narrative of a global Green New Deal.
I was just going to quickly, Kian.
No, go ahead. Go ahead, please.
Just two small quick points. I completely agree. I think we need a lot of solidarity among groups, civil society groups across the world. I think of one example of all of the efforts right now that are going to improve energy access, you know, in sub-Saharan Africa, and there's a huge big movement towards trying to harness renewable energy and solar photovoltaics. And I really worry about whether those new systems are really serving the needs of people on a longer term. And I think really understanding what lessons can be learned from all those experiences on the ground across the world would be really important at that scale. At the same time, I do think that it's being such a global problem, we really have to think about, you know, intellectual property rights and issues at an international scale. And I think, for example, COVID is showing us a little bit about that, where there's a lot of controversy now where we've understood that the supply side of the market has been restricted to some extent, and that's costing millions of lives now. And it's almost a time lapse of what could happen with climate change on a longer time scale. I think we need to really think hard about managing intellectual property around technology, because that is going to be part of it. And we need to anticipate, learn from COVID, to think about how we can better structure agreements to make sure we don't have this happen again.
Yeah, and I'll just say something in response, Billy, to one part of your question about Biden's rhetoric and China. Like when I heard that, and I was hearing the America First rhetoric of his speech, I was thinking, you know, on the one hand, I was disappointed, but on the other hand, I was thinking, what else do we expect? He is also juggling domestic politics where without a kind of like America First framing, you're not going to get a massive or semi-massive, as it were, infrastructure bill passed. And I think that what that leads me to think is that, you know, we need to decenter American leadership, but recenter or center way more American accountability. Like the global problem is us, really. And so like, how can we think of ways not to count on global climate leadership in times where that kind, the sort of like legislative politics from the top down may not quite be there, but to think about what does it mean for us to all take accountability for 195% reduction from, you know, 15 years ago. And I think, you know, one way, just to talk about your work, Billy, with the Green New Deal Studios and the overall thrust to think about what it means to live social, spatial lives at an accountable and just carbon emissions level. I think that is actually, it's super important. We don't see enough of it. We know what it, especially for those of us who are researchers and activists, we know what has to be done, but we don't, or we know the numbers of what we have to get to. We don't always have the visions of the, you know, exciting, just climate lives that we could possibly be part of in the future.
These are all, yeah, I think fabulous responses to my very jumbled question there. And so I'm actually going to pick up a couple of these threads because we have a couple of themes related to your responses in the Q&A. One of those themes is kind of around technology transfer and intellectual property, and another is kind of about the role of the state, and maybe where those two things kind of overlap. And just to give this a bit more context, right? I think these themes, these questions, these remarks, I think are especially relevant given, I think, what Narasimha pointed us to earlier, just a moment ago, around the various ways in which sort of North-South relations have been foregrounded by the COVID crisis. And particularly given that just a week or two ago, my sense of time has disappeared in the last year, but I feel like it was a week or two ago, that Bill Gates put out his statement, declaring he would not make mRNA tech available to the rest of the world at free of cost. And I think that, coupled with the sort of once potential and now I think reality of the Green New Deal's program being co-opted through this kind of nationalist politics and through a kind of eco-modernist programming that really puts the deployment and commercialization of technology at the core and sets justice aside as kind of a fringe consideration of what a global Green New Deal might be. I wonder how you all are thinking about these questions about how, as we think about decentering the US's role, in something like a global Green New Deal, how technology transfer, how intellectual property, and perhaps what the role of the state might play in sort of facilitating that at a global scale.
I can start. I just almost try not to repeat what I said, but I do think, market creation in the industrialized countries, for technologies, what we've seen happen with solar photovoltaics, it kind of could be a model, I think, for things like offshore wind and other technologies where we just have massive public support in the US and in the EU for these technologies and create a market that allows companies to really build up a scale. But I think the bigger challenge is really the deployment. We focus so much on R&D, but really having people adopt these technologies across the entire globe, that's a real massive challenge. And I don't really know the answer to that, but at least we need to flag that aspect of the supply chain that we're not thinking about enough.
Yeah, on the IP, the IP issue for us is obviously, we have been involved with this effort to waive TRIPS as part of in the WTO as a way of giving developing countries access to technology to allow for producing the vaccine itself. It's not an accident that Pfizer was one of the companies in the 1980s that was pushing the hardest for TRIPS legislation in the Uruguay round of the WTO, and accompanied by audio visuals and electronic. They saw the value of this long before developing countries understood the danger that it posed to putting it into a rules-based judicial type of system. Now, and rolling that back, I think, is one of the big challenges that developing countries now face, as the efforts, to be quite frank, from advanced economies. It's not only that they've resisted the TRIPS waiver outrageously, it's that they want to further tighten intellectual property rules and use the WTO and other bilateral and free trade agreements to push that agenda, to tighten that agenda even further. And that poses a huge challenge, I think, for developing countries. Just on the, I think people forget a little bit. If you use the New Deal analogy, I guess there is a certain history that one should recall when using Roosevelt extracted himself from the then highly deflationary international system that was the norm in the 1920s and the 1930s. The gold standard was, in a way, the parallel of an earlier era of the hyperglobalization era that we're currently in. It was necessary for Roosevelt to remove himself from that system, to be able to create a set of new state institutions and to develop a public sphere that was not possible under the rules of the game of the 1920s and the 1930s. And in that sense, Biden's actions may not be as reactionary, although we oppose some of them in the work that we do, but they may not be as reactionary as some people think. They actually may be necessary, because it's very difficult for me to see a lot of Biden's climate agenda getting past the WTO rules, for example, including the intellectual property rules. So the need for the hegemon, and it is still the hegemon, to extract itself from this neoliberal system actually may open up a lot of opportunities for developing countries, including rolling back the diminution of the policy space that developing countries have been complaining about since the start of the Uruguay round. So I think you've got to look at some of the opportunities and the ambiguities in Biden's actions. The anti-China stuff is obviously something that we find to be completely unacceptable. But I think there is opportunities in his agenda that need to be leveraged within the context of the global Green New Deal.
I'll give it just one more second in case Dipti or Kian wanted to add anything at the end here, but we are close to time. I know I see Daniel has reappeared.
Yeah, I want to hear from.
Oh, sorry. I just want to say I want to hear from both of you before we close out. So. Yeah.
Okay, so Billy, I thought it was interesting when you noted in your summary of the talks that solidarities exist among these networks of global water management consultants, that in some ways, like, they're all part of like an emerging cohort of folks who look to each other, usually within these institutions of power, to get what they want to get done. And I would note that that these structures are not, they're not as solidified as we might think. I think when I tell the short form of this story, it is in some ways like inevitably, oh, look, Dutch colonial power reconstituted as Neo-Colonialism. And I think that it is a more complex story than that. And even within the kinds of global plan making that we see a softness in the structure where the power relationships might be stubborn, like the historical like temporal power relationships are stubborn and they are brought forwards. But there are institutions, there are individuals as part of these structures that are learning as they do what they do. And I see in some ways interconnections from the ground up and the top down in a lot of the ideas about how we can move forward in responding to, in the cases that I look at, usually responding to climate threats rather than reducing emissions per se. But I do think that we can look to these places where, like global figures, like people, like folks like Henk Ovink, of the like Dutch and now global water planner Henk Ovink, looks to and calls upon organizers like Damaris Reyes, go to Lower East Side in New York. It's not that our societies are transformed, but there are notes where learning happens, and I think that we can push a little bit in these places in order to see how we can come up with better models that actually focus on what I would like to call a marginalized first way to go about doing climate plans.
I can quickly comment on this issue as well. I think this is a really critical question. And for me, it goes to public versus private finance and the public versus the private sector. So when we're talking about technology at the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which of course governs all the climate change negotiations, what Southern countries are fighting for is, of course, the emissions reductions, drastic emissions reductions by the North in keeping with historical responsibility, but they're also fighting for climate finance, and they're also fighting for technology and capacity building. That has always been part of the story or what we are there at the climate negotiations to fight for, because we know it's absolutely critical. Our countries will not manage to do the energy transformation without the finance, without the technology, without the capacity building, as so many of you said already. But when we talk about the public monies, and it's interesting, there was a question also about that. What about the philanthropists and the money that they're giving? We really need to be talking about public monies. We need to be talking about publicly accountable money, and not allow so-called innovators to get away by saying, oh, we're in the private sector, and US holds innovation highly above everything else. I'm sorry, that just cannot be the case. A lot of the innovation, you're academics, you will know this better than me. A lot of the innovation is happening with public monies, with the people's money, and yet it's being used for profit. And I think these are the things that we need to be fighting against. And when we talk about technology for, solar technology, as Narasimha were talking about, we need to go back to the principles. What are the principles that need to really underpin our energy transformation? And that means, I can put this link in the chat as well. And that means we need to be looking at appropriate technologies, appropriate renewable energy technology at each level. And why is it that our public monies are still in the northern countries, the tax money, your tax money is going to fossil fuel subsidies, whereas the solar industry or the renewable industry is being able to say, oh, we have our patents and we're going to protect our intellectual property rights, but public monies are going to fossil fuels. So there's something about, we need to think really carefully about public money is really the people's money. What is it being used for? And what is, who's getting away by saying it's for something else? And we need to really be able to challenge that, I feel like.
This was the perfect place, I think, to end the panel on. So I'll just thank our panelists really quickly for this incredible conversation. And then I'll thank you so much for today. And Daniel, over to you to close this out.
Thank you. Yes, enormous thanks to Dipti, Richard, Kian, and Narasimha, and to everyone who turned up and stuck around. We've been well over 100 folks in the audience for this entire conversation, which is absolutely fantastic. Don't have that seating capacity in person, so there are some benefits to going online. I want to pull out one last note from what you said there, Dipti, ending so well. The idea of public money, public institutions, public technology, and I think latent in this conversation, and especially prominent in Kian's conversation, is the idea that we're not talking about the global Green New Deal as the return of the state, the post-war developmental or the post-war welfare state, boom, question solved, but transforming relations, a priority of public needs, public goods, human rights, decent standards, and I think shared to different degrees of explicitness, an idea that we really have to reimagine what an economic democracy, democratic economic system would look like around the world and within various places in the world. So this is a huge topic. I think overall, these comments are so great, it's impossible to really feel satisfied by one panel on such an enormous topic. So I hope that the insane number of questions, 26, they'll end up on the event page, I've copied them all, testifies to how much thirst there is for talking about this, how much need there is, these really fascinating comments from all different kinds of sectors. Kian alone just glossing the urban question, questions of trade, intellectual property, economic development, climate diplomacy. So just an enormous number of topics, and we're going to keep talking about them. I have to, before letting you go, just share the screen and remind you that next week we're going to be taking up these conversations again in the Latin American context. We'll be hearing from Camilla Graham-Cow, who in some sense will take the torch from Richard. She is at UN ECLAC, the storied Economic Commission Latin America and the Caribbean. Catherine Hochstetler, who is an expert in industrial policy and green economic development, as well as environmental policy in Brazil and also in South Africa. Cia Rio Francos, one of the co-hosts of the series, an expert on extractivism. And Beto Verissimo, who is one of the great leaders in the Amazon, thinking about new models for preventing deforestation and reforesting the economy in democratic ways, and Michael Weisberg from Perry Worldhouse and Philosophy here at Penn moderating. So we're going to keep this conversation going, a cacophony of voices, and hope to hear from all of you soon. And a reminder to everyone in the audience, you'll be getting emailed soon with the video from this event, and then down the road with a whole resource page on the Global Green New Deal and conversations, additional conversations with every one of our panelists and guests. So once again, thank you all so much, and we're going to keep this conversation going. Take care.